you learn the most about yourself in work and in love when you try to go see what you're made of, whether it's like in the workplace or in your creative endeavors or as an entrepreneur. It's like the feedback will tell you, whether it's fair or unfair. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing. We aren't even self-aware about how self-aware we are. And so you're right. Eventually, the world tells us. But it takes a while because the world is filled with, ruinous empathy where people don't ever tell us what we need to know because they don't want to hurt our feelings.
The person in front of you knows more about them than you do. You talk to them once, maybe twice a week, right?
Yeah.
They're with themselves all the time. You just met them. And I think that's really important, especially when you're early in your training, because you're so excited to talk about these frameworks and apply these tools, and you want to rush in and you want to rush to restore. And I know I made this mistake as a freshman clinician. You rush in and you're like, this is what's wrong, and they can't even hear you because they're just not there.
That's a beautiful explanation.
Hello, and welcome to Psychobabble. My name is Joe Nucci, and today I have the honor of sitting down with Dr. Suzy Welch. Dr. Suzy Welch is a professor, a researcher, an author. She is currently at, if I'm not mistaken, at NYU, Stern School of Business.
Correct.
And her new book is called Becoming You. May I call you Suzy, or do you prefer
Please.
Professor Welch?
Oh, for goodness sakes. I like it when my students call me Professor Welch, but you may call me Suzy, please.
All right. Well, I feel like, from your content to your book, I've learned so much of you, and maybe it was just kind of giving me, like flashbacks to being in college or grad school or something. And so I'm kind of putting you in the professor category. But, I want to hear more about you, about your content that I think is great. I initially discovered you via Instagram. And I want to hear about your book. But before we dive into all of that, I would personally love to know just a little bit more about you. How did you get put on this path? Like, was this something that you were always passionate about? Or how do you understand like the development and the trajectory that you're on?
I'm so glad that your podcast is 12 hours because that's about how long it will take for me to describe that. No, I will give you the Cliff Notes version of it. Okay, so this is relevant. I mean, I grew up in a hippie family. My dad was an architect and my mom was an artist. I was born in Oregon. These were the days where truly you were put outside to go play in the woods. And I really, I came from a family that was really, like when the Bob Dylan album came out, this was the big event. And there was a lot of fishing that went on and playing in the woods. But I got very lucky and I ended up getting a wonderful education. I was sent away for boarding school and then I went off to Harvard and Harvard Business School. And I think that my family still doesn't really understand how this happened to me, but I was following this calling. I was very curious from a very young age. I think even in high school, I started to be really curious about the narratives of sort of epic heroes. Like, how did people discover who they were and how hard it is once you know your own narrative and your own your dream of your own narrative, how you actually live it out. Is it even possible? And I remember I was like in 9th grade and I was reading Notes from the Underground by Dostoevsky, and I came upon the quote, "Suffering is the origin of consciousness." And I was just completely hung up on this, I thought that, okay, I've got to learn everything to find out what's going on. And so I had some kind of life of the mind going on. Okay. Mm-hmm. But when I graduated from college, coming from this hippy-dippy family, there had been no discussion whatsoever of careers or how one made money or whatever. And I think my mom is old school Italian, and the idea was I was find a nice husband and settle down. And that did not happen. But I followed my skills at that point, my aptitudes, and I became a crime reporter at the Miami Herald. I had worked at the Harvard Crimson Daily newspaper. And these two guys came into the newsroom one day and they said, "Does anybody want to live in Miami?" And I had no job at that time, but I certainly needed one. And I said, "I'd like to live in Miami. That sounds good to me." It was 1981, middle of the riots and the boat lifts. And little did we know, because there was no internet in those days, but that the reason why they were looking for reporters up in the college newspaper newsrooms was that they had had a strike and everybody had been fired. And so they had no reporters in the Miami Herald newsroom. And there, lo and behold, suddenly these young, very inexperienced but extremely hungry, couple dozen reporters showed up, and I was one of them. And this set me off on a career as a reporter. I learned a lot about human nature, especially because I covered crime. And I would start each day at the morgue, and we'd walk down by the bodies, and we'd find out how they got killed. And I was a pretty tough kid, and so I could take it. It wasn't pretty, but I learned a ton. And then very serendipitously, a few years into that, I got assigned to cover business against my will. I did not want to do that. I didn't know a thing about business. I didn't know what went on in office towers. I definitely knew it was something that was foreign to me. And I said, I know nothing. I can't do this. And my boss said, look, you're the warm body and you're doing it. And so I started covering business, and it was a very transformative experience for a young, rather feral crime reporter, because I thought, oh my God, this is actually the most interesting thing I've ever heard about. These are people who are building companies, and like there's this thing called the economy, and it makes everything go or not go. I mean, I know it sounds crazy. I could have, at that point in my life, I could have told you a ton about politics and crime, and I could have told you how cities work, and I could have told you a lot about Japanese art, which I dutifully studied in college and still love very much, but nothing useful. But then I discovered this. It was like, there's this scene in Harry Potter where he crosses over from one train platform to another, and he discovers there's this whole parallel universe. That was me.
Right.
And but one thing I also realized is I was dumb, but I was smart enough to realize that I knew nothing about business, that this was a language and a people and a colony and a planet that had its own rules and information and people, and I had to learn. And so I decided, well, I know where people learn things. They learn them in schools. And so I was in Boston because it's where my husband was working, and I was working at that time, and because we had moved from Miami, and I got into Harvard Business School. And this started me off into my career in business. And eventually I went on and combined my careers in business and journalism, and I became a business journalist. And that's how my life was bumping along. I had a show on CNBC, worked at CNBC, worked at the Today Show for a long time, and was building a career as a business journalist. But I hungered to be in business, and I ended up starting a business and running a business. And look, when you're old, the story goes on for a very long time. I'm going to try to wrap it up here. I started working for Oprah as her careers columnist, and my focus became to really on how people build meaningful careers. That fascinated me because I saw so many people who regretted their careers or did not find meaning in their careers. And I was writing a lot about this, and I wrote a book about it, and I got the experience of being out on a book tour and hearing people say, I do this work and it has no meaning to me. And this started a journey of really exploring intellectually the components of a meaningful career. And I wrote a lot about it. I wrote a couple books about it. And I toiled in this area, again, going back to the Today Show and working as their careers correspondent. And then my life hit a complete and total brick wall in a devastating way when I lost my husband, who died in 2020. And it was not a surprise. We had known he was sick. He was in hospice at home for a year, which was good and bad because you get to say goodbye. And that's good. And the kids all came home, 4 children, and they all came home, and we had a year together. But it's bad because it's so bad. When I came out the other side of that, he died right as COVID was beginning. And we all kind of went into the woods of our minds and our hearts. I actually physically went into the woods with my kids and thought I was never coming out because of my life. And when I came out, it was to go back to the Today Show. They very, very wonderfully asked me to go back. And I thought, wait, I'm different now. And there's a different road for me. And I had at that point an idea for methodology that could help people create lives and work of meaning. I had it. I thought. I had a name for it, and I had roughed it out. And I knew I was very fortunate to know the dean of the business school at NYU, and I approached him and said, I have an idea for a class I wish I had taken when I was 22 years old. And he said, let's try it as an experiment, Suzy. Let's just do a small experiment. And, it didn't last as an experiment for very long, because if you create a class called Becoming You, Crafting the Authentic Life You Want and Need, and you offer it to young people, they will come and take it. That it is truly one of those, if you build it, they will come.
Oh my
and
God,
they did.
totally.
It was like, the dean called me and he was like, we're going to try this to 20 people. And then I got a call a few weeks later saying, like, how do you feel about teaching 80 people? And I said, I've not taught before. And he said, well, how do you feel about it? And I was like, okay, because the wait, I did not know them, but the wait list was kind of out of control because based on what? The name of the class? Maybe some students knew me from TV. I don't know. The course description was well written because I'm a writer. But anyway, I taught it one semester. There was a very positive reception to the class, and I was, I was very humbled to be asked to join the faculty. So I joined the faculty. I started teaching management as well, and took on all the duties of a full faculty member, which was very exciting. I remember thinking one day, what made me think I could do this, as I was sitting in a faculty meeting, because it was a brand new world. But it was the right world. It was the world where I was meant to be. I then realized I needed to complete my PhD, which was very unfinished work in my life. And I went ahead and did that, which was a very proud moment for me. And I did it in the field of values expression, not values formation, which is what you do. Those of you who are psychotherapists and therapists listening to this, you uncover and you excavate and you analyze how people come by their values and how they become who they are. For me, in my work, which is helping people find meaningful, productive careers, I take them as they are. I say, okay, those are your values. Now let's talk about what your aptitudes and your interests are, so we can find some appropriate work for you. My students always want to share with me their values formation journeys. Like, okay, yeah, I really value belonging, or I really value family centrism. And they want to start telling me about the reasons why. And I say, please take that up with your therapist. This is above my pay grade. I have no, I'm really, I'm interested vaguely. I'm interested in other things about them. But I was like, I'm always like, this is not my area. But I'm grateful for all the therapists that my students go to, because they often say in class, well, I was talking to my therapist about this, and I'm always interested to hear I would love to know what the therapists are thinking when they come into class and come into their sessions and talk about the class. But anyway, that's how I got to where I was.
All right.
I have 4 children, by the way. I should add that I have 4 children and 3 dogs.
Okay. Amazing. Well, there's so much I want to reply to. I'll go in no order in particular. The first is, I'm so sorry to hear about your loss. I lost my dad. I've spoken about grief in my journey with that when I was 11 when he passed, and his was a surprise. And so I really resonate with, even though your experience was so different from mine, I really resonate with the idea where, like, well, there's good and bad things about it, because that's exactly how I feel. And it's very, difficult to explain to people who haven't had the experience. And so I just want to say, I'm sorry.
I want to be clear that there were good and bad things about having a year in hospice, but there's only bad things about losing him. But I think of course, you get what can you do? He wanted me to, and I'm sure the same would be true about your dad. He wanted me to go on living. He wanted me to have a big and wonderful life. He repeatedly told me, go have a spectacular life, Suzy. And, so, and I'm sure the same would be true for your dad.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's number one. Number two, one of the reasons why I was so drawn to your page and your work is because number one, I like your what a psychotherapist might call it, your kind of solution focused approach to some of these problems. Because yes, I think that more than not, the psychoanalytic or like the therapist instinct is to go and kind of excavate the past. And then number two is that we want to be able to kind of do something with those insights. And sometimes I think the traditional therapeutic training falls a little bit short. And so I think that your style, if you will, and you mentioned before we started recording that a lot of therapists have looked at your new book and they've actually been like taking these tools and turning around and applying them quite effectively. And I certainly want to get into that a little bit later. But one of the other reasons why I was really drawn to you is because I was very surprised when people asked me, what was your favorite class in your graduate program? I am sometimes surprised to say it was career counseling. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why it was so surprising to me, and maybe in hindsight it's not that surprising, was just because it came up in my internship all the time with the clients and patients that I was treating. Whether it was disability accommodations or problems at work or wanting to change a career, or a younger person not knowing what to do. And a lot of us spend more times with our jobs than we might with our families. And so of course it's actually a really deeply meaningful part of your life. And it also completely blew my mind to learn that, some people are not career oriented, right? That there's kind of different types. There's so many different types of careers, number one, but then different kind of personalities and how people go about navigating our economy, like you said. And so it was it was a video I remember very clearly where you were talking about, what to do when your values are in conflict. And my impression from all of the content I've consumed of yours and the stuff that I've read is that this is something that really trips a lot of young people up when they're trying to figure out what to do with their values.
And old people. And all people.
Yeah.
I mean,
oh,
values,
I know all people. Okay.
All people and young people. But I mean, I teach Becoming You in open enrollment, and the vast majority of those people are over 40, and they come in and they are big baskets of values conflicts, and it's very human to have values and conflict. Look, let's just talk about values for a second. With your audience, most of them know what values are, but and maybe that's the people who show up in my research. I've done research that has asked people what are values and can you define a value and give examples of values, and only 17% of people come close to understanding what values are. What is going on is people mix up values and virtues. If you ask a typical person on the street, or a client comes in, a patient comes in, as you call them, I call them clients, comes in, and you say, what are your values? They'll say kindness, integrity, fairness, whatever. And those are all beautiful virtues, virtues being social and cultural constructs that we all agree everyone should have more of. Whereas values are all exist on a continuum. I believe there's 15 of them. In this way, I'm different than Schwartz, who many of your listeners may be aware of, who believes there's 19, and Alport Strang, who believes there's 14. I believe there's 15 values continuums. This is a wonderful thing to be able to nerd out like this a little bit. And they all exist on a continuum, and they're choices about how we want to act and decide and show up in this world. I say you always know it's a value if it would decide where you worked, where you went on vacation, and who you'd marry. Then you know their values. And so, is there some overlap between values and virtues? Not really. What I do is that my students and my clients are all tested on their values. We use a tool that I created in the Becoming You labs at NYU called the Values Bridge. It's like Alport Strang and Schwartz, except for that I think the values are more modern, and I think that I'm less judgy than those values inventories, if I do so say so. Because I don't call self-care hedonism, okay? Because I don't do that. I think that's not correct. Okay, so that's me having a values judgment. But I also think that my assessment tool allows you to have two values in conflicts, where the other ones can't. If you have one value, they don't allow you to hold the other value. That's how they're constructed. But the truth of the matter is, I've almost never met a human being who doesn't have some values in conflict. For instance, you can have very high family centrism. That would be the value of screening all your actions and decisions through the impact on your family. And you can also have very high work centrism, which is the desire to organize your life around your work. You actually can have both those values. It's not easy or fun, but a lot of us have them. And you can have many of my students have as a number one value what I call eudaimonia. I use the Greek word for flourishing, because I don't want to call it hedonism. It's self-care. It's pleasure, it's recreation, it's stuff that feels good, it's sex, whatever it is, feels good to you. It's called eudaimonia. And a lot of my students have that as, they don't want to postpone joy. It's their number one value. But here's the thing, is that the test shows that their number two value is affluence.
Okay, then.
Okay. And so then they ask me, Professor Welch, is this a problem? And I say, I think it actually is. I'm sorry. And then they sort of get mad at me that this is the way the world works. And I say to them, well, I'm sorry. I did not design the world. I showed up here just like you. Right. And maybe you'll be the generation that solves that problem. But right now, those are pretty hard values to hold at the same time, although many people try.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to consider like the role that like paradox plays when you're trying to like integrate these values. Yep. How do you explain that to people you teach, or like, I know you've written about this and talked about this a lot, because I think that one of the things that it took me, and I'm still learning, to say that I've fully integrated this lesson would be a vast overstatement, but to be comfortable with paradox, to embrace it, is something that I think has just helped me, just like in my values alignment and action and my mental health, because sometimes it doesn't really make sense, right? Like I value my health, and I also value, relationships and socializing. Yeah. And so sometimes the choice to go out for a drink or stay up later is in direct contradiction to my values around health. But then, if you really want to then get into it, as I'm sure you're familiar with, there's all this like research done on how social relationships are actually a protective factor when it comes to, and then it becomes so confusing.
Yeah. I mean, I often say, look, our lives are full-time paradox management. And sometimes my students will talk about anxiety. They'll say such and such and such is causing me anxiety. Now, I'm separating anxiety. I'm talking sort of garden variety anxiety separate from the true clinical anxiety, which is a true medical condition. But my students use anxiety generally very loosely. And they'll say, this is causing me anxiety. And I say, no, you're just actually at this moment managing a paradox, which is actually the human condition. And we do this day in and day out, and we get better and better at it. And eventually we have to make some decisions around it. So say you have in conflict eudaimonia and affluence and maybe achievements up there also to really stir the pot. And at a certain point, you get exhausted of every single minute of your life managing that paradox. And you start to make decisions about what's going to be expressed and what's going to be sublimated so that you have a life that is not full-time paradox management. But there's some paradoxes we just have to manage our whole life long. And we get pretty good at it. And we get some language around it. And I mean, in my world, we talk about this paradox management openly by talking about our values. We'll say like, the other day I was giving a speech over Google, and I'm very, very high on the value of beholderism, which is often called aesthetics. I really care about how things look. This is the way it's described is a measure, a reflection of how much you care about how your spaces look, your places look, your stuff looks, and how you look. And I grew up with these parents who were artists. I mean, I don't know the reasons why. I have high beholders, and maybe it's a proxy for caring about harmony, because you can't control much in your life, but you can control how your spaces look, say. But anyway, I have very high beholderism. I was over at Google giving a speech, and my beholderism was like on steroids. I was like, I want to work at this company. The offices are so beautiful. But we were, and then I left thinking I'd never want to work at Google in a million years because none of the work matches my values in other ways. And I don't have any of the aptitudes. But it's fun it's freeing to be able to talk about the expression of your values instead of sort of talking about it as a paradox. It's like, my beholderism makes me want to work in one of these fancy glitzy offices, but my other values and my aptitudes make that a complete non-starter for me. One time I was guest lecturing at Stanford, and I taught Becoming You there. And afterwards, a student came up to me and she said, your work reminds me of this great quote by Wittgenstein. I was like, oh man, I really am at Stanford, right? This is a great quote. To have a student walk up to you and say that. And I said, what's the quote? And she said, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And I was like, that's exactly true, is that when we have a language to talk about our values and other parts of ourselves, I mean, this is what you do as psychotherapists, is you give people a language to understand themselves and to talk about themselves and understand themselves. It really opens up your world.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I love about hearing you talk about values is there's the practicality aspect that we've already covered, but I love how the way you speak about them is, as much as it can be, it seems to be, to me at least, completely void of any like political or moral implication or judgment. And that's not to say that your values, like you can't be judgmental about values and you can't order them in some sort of a hierarchy. But I think that's, particularly in today's world, that seems to be like it's just a cool idea to get present to, you know what I mean? Because I think about,
what you're saying is I hear it all the time. I'm like a total values agnostic. I don't care. There's no better or worse value, only better or worse for you. This is not true of virtues. Okay. I mean, I think that with a virtue, I want everybody to be kinder. I want everybody to be gentler. So I mean, I'm talking about virtues. That's a totally different thing. But when it comes to like the value of scope, how big and exciting a life you want versus how controlled and predictable a life, that's one of the values, or beholderism. What do I care? One of my closest friends is a lawyer. She walks out of her house every day with a big knot in the back of her hair, and her house is a complete pigsty. She has low beholderism. I love her. And she doesn't understand why I spend so much time looking for the perfect rug. It's like, but we can love each other and not judge each other. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's understanding your values and having a language around them is an invitation for us to stop freaking judging each other all the time. And now virtues is another matter, though. Kindness to animals, for instance, like I'm not going to say whatever you feel is okay. I'm not there, but that's a virtue.
Fair. No, I completely understand. What's coming up for me is that sometimes I think about values conflict, like in couples therapy,
Yeah.
and how sometimes their relationship philosophies are misaligned, and they don't realize this till like years after they're married, or whatever it
Yeah.
might be. But I'm thinking about relationships in a workplace, and I'm thinking about how do you think about it? So there's like the values or culture or virtues or lack thereof of a company that you would go work for. But then there's
100%.
building out a well-rounded team, right?
Yes.
And you may not necessarily want everyone to have the same value structure,
Well,
depending on the team that you're
okay.
managing.
So I think a lot about this. Okay.
Yeah.
What you really, we've used my values measurement tool in all sorts of corporate settings, and I have strong feelings about this. So when you're building out a team, what you really want are members with different aptitudes and skills and expertise. But in general, you probably like most of them to have the same values, and you'd like those values to be aligned with the company's values. So for instance, let's take the value of belonging. Belonging is how much time people like to spend with each other, how communitarian they are. And teams are more productive when people are generally in the same place on the continuum of belonging. Okay, everybody kind of is the individual contributor and they leave each other alone, or everybody is very communitarian. Like I have a high belonging team at my own company, and everybody eats lunch together and they go out. I don't do it with them, but they all go out together after work and so forth. They're all, and wouldn't it be weird if there was a person on that team who was very low belonging? It would be kind of awkward because they would never be part of this. But believe me, when I built my team, I made sure that on the aptitude front, I had generalists and specialists. I had brainstormers and idea concentrated focusers. So companies have values. And by the way, cities have values and countries have values. I mean, I'd love to do a values profile of, say, New Orleans in Italy, okay, and compare them to, Detroit and Germany. But because that's sort of national culture stuff, which was what Schwartz really studied very closely. But if you think about companies, there's been incredible research. I was actually part of the team that replicated this research. I didn't conduct it myself. Research shows that when an individual's values closely align with the company's values, that they're definitely have higher retention, productivity, and satisfaction levels. It just makes sense, okay? So I went and did this work at a very large tech company, which will remain nameless. And the manager who brought me in said, well, we know our company values, our team's values, and we're going to have everybody do the values bridge, and then we're going to compare. And I said, look, I want you to know something. You may lose people through this process because here are your top 5 values, and there may be people who have those as peripheral values or don't have them as values at all. And they're going to see that they don't share this organization's values, and they may think about leaving. And she said, I want them to leave. So this was kind of an interesting moment, right? And I get it. Like I have like a huge value in my organization on urgency, which would be expressed as high scope. And I don't want somebody here who has low urgency. We've got a lot of work to do. But believe me, there's companies with low urgency. They should go work at a company with low urgency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there's a third distinction here that's really important, and the distinction is aptitude. And it's about so there's the virtues, which is kind of like the more, maybe the most like philosophical category. And so it's kind of like, something that like everybody should have. These are universal principles, something like honesty, or kindness or whatever it might be.
Yes,
and
I generally don't deal with virtues, but yes, right.
Yeah. So so you distinguish that from your values, right?
Yes.
Which is distinguished from like the aptitude. And for you, the values is really about, but how do you act out these aptitudes, these virtues, these morals and ethics that you have in your behavior? Like at the end of the day, like what choices are you making or more likely to make?
Yeah. Let's unpick the methodology for a second. So virtues is not part of my methodology. My methodology helps people figure out what work they should be doing. And what it says is the work you should be doing lies at the intersection of your values, your aptitudes, and your economically viable interests. So values, we look at through the lens of this values inventory and the test, and we do a bunch of different exercises and you figure out what your values are. But that's not the only thing you should be paying attention to, because you could have place a very high value on what we call luminance, which is fame, and not be good at anything enough to be famous for it. And so we also look at, problem. We also look at aptitudes, and I am building on, this is nothing new. Social scientists have established that there's 52 aptitudes. In my work, I test on 8 of them, the 8 big cognitive aptitudes, interpersonal approach, inductive reasoning, time frame orientation. And so these are just pure on aptitudes. They're cognitive aptitudes, and all people are wired along these 8 big continuums of how they make decisions and process information. And then we also look at emotional aptitudes, which are really personality. And the reason we do that is, again, my work is relentlessly practical, I'm afraid, but you can be very, very good at some job because of your personality. You can be very, very bad at a job because of your personality. And so we do this sometimes painful work of identifying people's personality traits, not as they would describe them, because that's irrelevant, but as how the world experiences them. Mm-hmm. That's a big day. And so we do some real testing. When you find out how the world actually experiences you, that's often a very big day. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got wasn't from a therapist or a book. It was actually from my aunt. And I remember she said to me, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but she basically said, you learn the most about yourself in work and in love. And what she meant was, it's like when you actually try to date people and try to actually establish an intimate relationship with someone, or when you try to go see what you're made of, whether it's like in the workplace or in your creative endeavors or as an entrepreneur or whatever it is, it's like the feedback will tell you, whether it's fair or unfair. Right. Yeah.
Your aunt she was so right. The thing about it is that sometimes it takes a very long time for that to penetrate our noggins. I have a test that people answer a few quick questions about themselves, and then they give it to 40 people to answer those questions, and they get the feedback aggregated anonymously. And then we calculate a self-awareness score that sort of shows how you compare to what everyone's saying about you. And beforehand, I love saying to people, how do you think your self-awareness is? And everybody's always like, oh, it's going to definitely be in the 90s. And most people is 54% or below. And that's the typical. And so, we aren't even self-aware about how self-aware we are. So you're right. Your aunt was right. Eventually the world tells us, but it takes a while because the world is filled with, ruinous empathy, where people don't ever tell us what we need to know because they don't want to hurt our feelings.
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth? I am learning about the concept of, I like how you described it as ruinous, but it's like, I've heard it described as like toxic empathy, or like the pathological kind of compassion. Learning about it is getting trained as a clinician really, really deeply like affected me in a way like I never fully recovered from, like in a good way, because I think it's made me a better therapist. But it really, it's one of those things where, you would expect somebody goes to shrink school and now they're just this sensitive flower, all the time. But I think it actually because I was already like that, arguably. I think it pushed me in the opposite direction, where it's given me, clinical practice has given me practice saying the hard thing, saying the thing that will cause them to be upset with you, but doing it in a way where you don't completely ruin the relationship, where they come back, you can work through it.
I mean, that's the hardest thing we learn in our life, radical candor, as Kim Scott would describe it, which is saying the thing that somebody needs to hear from a place that they understand is love. That is, it's really hard. And yet, if we can do that for other people, I mean, one of the reasons why people always wonder why does business like to hire athletes so much? And I know the answer is that athletes, college and high school athletes, from when they're really young, they come off the field and the coach doesn't say, hey, let's have a conversation about, how do you think it went out there? That you come off and they say, you suck, okay? You should have done X, Y, and Z. And the athletes from a very young age have been conditioned to hear blunt feedback. And therefore, when they go into the workplace, they hear the blunt feedback and it doesn't blow their minds. And this is why business loves hiring athletes. Now, there's other reasons, sort of the bro culture and so forth. But I get it, because as a boss myself, giving feedback, you have to deal with the emotionality around it, and you just wish people understood. Like, I want you to be better because I love you, and I don't know how to make this. I don't know how to make this very hard message softer for you. Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I've often thought that because I grew up swimming and playing water polo through college, and I've always thought, whenever I would hear people like on a student athlete panel or something talk about how it's helped their career, when I was in high school and college, I didn't quite see it. You know what I mean? Like I
Right.
didn't connect because, like you said, these things kind of can unfold over years.
Yeah, you
But
think
one
they're
of the
dumb. What are they doing?
Yeah.
How come they got hired?
Totally.
They're dopes. And I'm going to tell you, they're getting hired because the bosses find them so easy to talk to because they have been
Right.
conditioned to hear hard messages.
Totally. I've also have thought. What do you think about this? I've had a theory for a while that I think that athletics or some sort of competitive endeavor teaches you how to integrate a competitiveness, aggression in a way that's healthy and useful, even valuable.
I don't think you played. I mean, I was a D1 athlete myself for
Yeah.
4 years. I don't think you go to that unless you've already got that in you. You're out the
Fair
first
enough.
season.
Yeah.
So I think what it does is it is a screen that says here are the people who have that in them already, the competitiveness
Yeah.
the business needs and wants. I think that another thing that college sports taught me was how to lose with grace. You lose, you're going to lose. It stinks. Sometimes you lose because of you. I mean, a very important game for us. I lost it. And you know, it was dreadful. And I mean, I imagine it's 40 years later. I still remember it. And you have to learn how to say you're sorry to your teammates and to get out and play better. I mean, so I think sports teach you a lot of stuff, but it definitely separates out the competitive people from the non-competitive.
Yeah. There's no doubt that there's a nature component. I would say from my personal experience, my parents really had to force me in to sports when I was younger. I didn't want to do it. I was such a nerdy, sensitive kid. You know, it didn't appeal to me. And it's interesting to, in hindsight, to look back and see how I adopted more of those traits, and they feel so natural now because like now I'm kind of like, well, I would say I'm naturally very moderately competitive. Like it can be fun, you know, it's not necessarily like such a big deal.
Yeah. I think I'm going to posit that you had some of these aptitudes and they had not yet developed, because when
So
you got
fair.
your own druthers, you would have left if you didn't have them in you.
That's so fair. Yeah, to children, adolescents. I mean, well, really, what we know now about the brain, right, is it's even into like your late 20s, right? It's your people develop different capacities, asymmetrically sometimes.
Yes, for
and that's
sure.
actually normal. I want to loop back to something you said about self-awareness, because every time I talk about self-awareness on my channel, it gets an incredible amount of engagement, and I wouldn't identify as I mean, I wouldn't separate or distinguish myself from any other therapist or anyone else who's psychologically trained in A, my level of self-awareness, or B, my knowledge of it. But I was fascinated by the research that you mentioned. What do you want more people to know about what we know about self-awareness? I imagine it's difficult to study, but that you've figured out some ways to do it.
Yeah, it's the bête noire of my field is self-awareness, in that I spend so much time in my work on values separating people from their identity issues because they are so unself-aware about how identity gets in the way of what their values are. At the beginning, I used to let people self-report their values, and then I would see people come up with their lists and literally manually manipulate their list to sort of move family from number 11 up to number 2 because they felt like it should be there. And so I would like watch that. I would say, oh, really? So I think that the funny thing about, self-awareness is by nature incredibly hard to study. I had this incredible experience with self-awareness when I was a young girl reporter in Miami. And I covered crime, as I said, and I hung out constantly with the cops. I mean, how do you find out about crime? I used to go from police station to police station saying, anybody got anything? It's the old days, right? There was literally no internet in 1981 when I got to Miami. And there was a police officer named Joe Lodato. He was a detective, and he said, Suzy, you're so naive. You just don't ever understand how bad people are. And I was like, I don't know. I think people are good and bad. And he said, yeah, people are liars. You just don't get that. And I said, I think that, they just couldn't stand how every single time somebody got arrested, I would say things like, he probably had a lot of trauma in his childhood. And so he brought me to the jail one time, and he said, hey, this guy's about to go up on trial for attempted murder of his girlfriend and her daughter. And he's dying to give an interview. This is going to be like a total, exclusive for you. So I sat there. He was in his orange jumpsuit, and he told me the whole sob story of his life. He was framed. The cops framed him. He had nothing to do with it. By the end, I was sobbing. I mean, this guy had been totally framed, and he poured out his story, and we said our goodbyes. I said, I'm going to cover your trial. This is an amazing story. And the next day his trial began, and he was, he was convicted in like one day. They had fingerprints, they had DNA, and literally he was so guilty that as he was walking out in handcuffs, he was so blatantly lied to me, and he was so guilty that he walked out. He looked at me, smiled, and shrugged like I tried, and I was completely gobsmacked. And the police thought this was hilarious. They basically set me up for this experience. And Joe Lodato said to me, "One thing you need to understand, Suzy, everyone writes the script of their life with themselves at the center as the hero." This was from a young cop. I have borrowed his poetry for many years. Everyone writes the script of their lives with themselves at the center as the hero. You know this as therapists. You sit there and you hear people tell their narrative, and they are always the center of the story and the hero of it somehow. And this guy just lied to make himself the center of it. They wanted me to understand that. And so this is where our self-awareness goes. It goes up in smoke as we write the story of our lives with ourselves. We lose are we the center of the story? Maybe not. Were we the hero? Very rarely. And yet we write that story and we lose self-awareness. And I feel compelled to say here that Joe Lodato, who was an incredible friend and source to me for many years later, lost his life in the line of duty, a great tragedy for the city of Miami. But he was a great teacher to me. So, anyway, so self-awareness, I have created this test to basically make the point to my students that their self-awareness is low and the work of their lives is increasing it. I took this test one year along with my students, and I thought I was going to have 100% perfect score on self-awareness because I'm so self-actualized and I teach this stuff. And I got really punched in the nose. I mean, I found out that I was experienced in ways I did not expect. And I afterwards got my kids on the phone who had been some of my 40 people evaluated me, and I found out that I was experienced as much more chaotic than I thought I was. And it was right after my husband died, and I just wasn't seeing myself because I'm a human being. And I asked my kids, like, what's going on? And they were like, "Mom, you're the hurricane. You're not the eye of the hurricane. You are the hurricane." And I had to become some more self-aware.
What do you I totally appreciate the anecdote of sometimes the feedback you get as you develop your self-awareness surprises you. A very different story. I remember years after high school, reconnecting and just kind of reminiscing about old times with a friend of mine from high school. And we got closer our senior year and kind of kept in touch through college. And I referred to her as, how like basically nice it must have been to be so popular in high school. I didn't feel that I was. And she looked at me, and I remember her jaw was on the floor, and she was like, "You were the popular one." And she was almost mad that I had reversed, the roles. And it was just, and that's the thing, like, there's so much great research on memory and how just unreliable it is, right? But it was just so funny to me where I was like, what even was your experience of me? Like in high school?
That's right.
And anyone else's,
I think it's super painful. This is particularly painful for high school kids. It really is, because they are the least self-aware. It's just,
right.
It's agonizing. But I'll tell you, when I'm in the room, when my open enrollment students in their 50s get their self-awareness feedback back, it's not like they're like, "Oh, I expected this." They usually are surprised as well. And life gets a lot better when we understand how people are experiencing us. It does. I think that we can just operate with so much more confidence.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things, who said it? I actually think it might have been a quote I picked up from Jordan Peterson, but he has this line in one of his lectures where he goes, "Honesty is curative when you're a counselor." And it really, I mean, right. It's so funny thinking about his brand, right? But I know for me, it's guided me as a therapist, because when I am feeling overly empathic, or it's a sensitive nature or whatever it is, it's kind of like, okay, well, how can I just be honest and say, not this is what the analysis is, or this is what the truth is, but this is how I'm experiencing you.
Yeah.
Tell this story, talk about your relationship. I'm not sure in my opinion whether or not I think you should stay in this relationship, right? But when I hear the way that you're treated or how you report yourself feeling, it almost always works. And so with that, I'm very curious, what are the one or two main things you wish more therapists knew about self-awareness or about helping people increase it? I think my field does an okay job, but if I'm being honest, I think a lot of times we're just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing if it sticks until we see that insight turn on.
I think that I hope I'm not going to say something that's offensive to your audience.
Oh,
I think
no,
that
do it.
I think my experience with therapists is that they let their patients go on for too long with their lack of self-awareness, that they indulge the narrative that people tell. And a lot of times I think therapists know full well that the person's narrative is lacking in self-awareness, and yet they let it play out and play out, I think for a lot of different reasons. And I think they are slower to challenge the narrative and sort of defend the other person's version of it because they are trying to be empathetic. I mean, they're just deeply empathetic in and obviously their job is to be the ally of the patient. But I think back to a time where I really needed my therapist. It was after my divorce from my first husband, and before I met my beloved husband, Jack. And in that period, I had a relationship that was just dumb. It was just a dumb relationship with a guy who was sort of like, I was drunk on freedom, and it was just a dumb relationship. And I look back and I think it was so obviously a destructive relationship. Where was my therapist? Why didn't they say, you're missing this? You know, I had no self-awareness in that 3-month period, 100% no self-awareness. And I think at one point I literally asked her, what do you think about the relationship? And she said to me, what do you think? And it was like, no, I need a self-awareness check here. I am not. And so look, this is a minor thing because my daughter's a therapist. The work she does is life-changing. Yeah. The world is grateful for her. I'm grateful for what she's done with her life. But the work you do is essential to humanity. But I think that, I don't know, is it the therapist's place even to sort of say, here's another way of looking at it. How early in the conversation do you actually say that? And I think this is where we're seeing therapists use the values bridge, is that people have a lot of time actually articulating their values and a lot of times admitting their values. But then the reason why I've seen it used off-label, but I'm delighted by it with therapists, is that their patients take it and then this data is right there. Like I was just working with somebody who got back her values bridge results, and her number one value was what we call luminance, which is fame. And her immediate reaction was like, I absolutely do not value fame. I don't want to be famous. That's ridiculous. And I said, well, the efficacy of this test is extremely high. It's 92%. Maybe you're in the 8% where we've gotten something a little bit wrong, but maybe not. Let's just sit with it for a while. And about 20 minutes later, she stormed in and said, okay, fine. It's true. Nobody has to know, right? And I said, just you and me. And she said, it's so true that this has been my number one value. I've never admitted it to myself or anyone around me. And yet it's the source of my rage that I've never been able to fulfill this value. And it really started a whole different conversation, and a very, very productive and fruitful one about what she was going to do about this truth. And so that's where we're seeing it being used in situations where therapists are finding this a way to start a conversation about stuff that is really being sublimated.
Yeah. So as we near the end here, I think 2 points and questions. The first is, I agree wholeheartedly with your criticism of the field. I want to posit a hypothesis as to why I think therapists fall short in this domain. And I want to tell you how I go about fixing it. And I'd love to know what you think, whether I'm thinking about it correctly, or maybe I can upgrade it a little bit. So I think the reason is because when we're trained in grad school, there's this value, or maybe it's a virtue, but of radical humility, this idea that the person in front of you knows more about them than you do. You talk to them once, maybe twice a week, right? Yeah. They're with themselves all the time. You just met them. And I think that's really important, especially when you're early in your training, because you're so excited to talk about these frameworks and apply these tools, and you want to rush in and you want to rush to restore. And I know I made this mistake as a freshman clinician. You rush in and you're like, this is what's wrong, and they can't even hear you because they're just not there.
That's a beautiful explanation. No, that's a beautiful and very eye-opening explanation. Yeah.
Well, it's that, but it's combined with a lot of really reliable literature that shows is they're much more likely to take their own advice, the patient. So oftentimes, you hear about maybe like the person they're dating, for an example, and you hear like, it's like, well, like this is obviously not their soulmate. Like, it doesn't take a therapist to understand this.
Right.
They're not there. And so the way I've threaded the needle, and this is actually something I talk a little bit about in my upcoming book that's getting published in the fall, is I say there's a difference between giving advice and like being directed, like this is what you should do and this is what you should think about it, and being honest, like I talked about earlier. So I may not say, I think that this dude is a completely clinical narcissist and abusive, and I think that you should end the relationship immediately and we should begin a course of trauma treatment. But I might say something like, when you tell me about the things he says to you, I feel absolutely sick to my stomach knowing that you accept that.
Interesting.
And it's in a way, it's actually, I think, harder for them to hear than the advice. You know what I mean? Because then they have to, because I'm not even making it right or wrong. I'm just being with them in the moment. And so I'm wondering what you think about that middle line for therapists to play with.
This is why you do what you do. This is a very enlightening thing for you to say. I think that's a beautiful explanation. I do think it's true when people come to their own conclusions, they are more likely to act on them. It's the road we all tread, though, isn't it? I mean, I think I have less time with I've got my students for 8 weeks with this class typically. And when I teach it in the wild in open enrollment, I have them for 3 days. And so I am kind of forced to be more directive. But again, they're not there for therapy. They're for the answer to the question, what should I do with my life? And so I tend to get quite directive. But I love your explanation. And I think it's a very, very good one.
Okay. Thank you. I'll continue to marinate on it and let you know.
Okay. All right,
you
thanks.
mentioned how this framework that you've developed is being used by therapists. What is there anything else in the book that is being used, or ways that this framework is being applied that is helping people on their mental health journey?
It's very interesting. When I was young, I was very good friends with my pastor's wife. And I said something once about the choir, like noticing something about the choir in church one Sunday. And she said, Suzy, after you've been a pastor's wife for a while, you realize that all the psychoses and dysfunction of the church show up in the choir. And I thought, oh, how interesting. That's where it all lands. It all shows up in the choir, right? Because anyway, there's a million reasons why, but it was a very funny thing she said to me. And I later realized, I was having a conversation with a therapist, and she said basically a sort of similar thing. She said, is what I've learned as a therapist is over the years, all of my patients' trauma and dysfunction shows up in their career. It shows up, but it presents in their career, in their primary relationships at work. And a lot of times she said the presenting symptom for somebody who comes in is that they're unhappy in their job or they've just been fired. And so her use of the tool is to talk to people about whether or not they're in the right careers. And so she does this sort of inventory of values, aptitudes, and interests. And then a lot of times, having gone, sort of doing a very abbreviated analysis of that, says, well, it looks like you might have been in the right career. Let's talk about what else might have been going on. Or to say, well, have you ever thought about the fact that you were doing work that was in no way aligned with your values or your aptitudes? So it's used as kind of yet another screen to find out why sometimes a person's trauma or pain or presenting symptoms are showing up in work settings.
I do remember hearing, I don't know if it's true or if it's just kind of anecdotally accepted, that people with ADHD will find themselves performing entrepreneurial endeavors because of how the whirlwind that entrepreneurship often is. And that's not necessarily the best role for every person with ADHD, but it's particularly if it's undiagnosed, you may wake up one day and find yourself that it's like you're, the stimulation, like the scatterness, like of your day feels aligned with something you just weren't aware of in your psyche because you didn't have the tools or you didn't have the medication.
Yeah, I have a different, maybe aligned, but a somewhat different take on this. And I think the reason why people with ADHD end up as entrepreneurs is that they cannot function in organizations because they're application of energy, their stamina, their ability to execute is all episodic. And what organizations need and reward are people who are steady state. You know when they're going to show up and how they're going to show up. And so some people with ADHD are just spectacularly talented, but it's episodic. You don't know which person's going to show up. You don't know if they're going to underdeliver or over-deliver, and organizations punish that. And so they wash out of organization after organization after organization because organizations are not built to contain episodic talent and aptitudes. And so it's not, a lot of times they're lonely being entrepreneurs because they can have very high belonging or very high feelings of, of achievement, wanting to be a part of organizations that are winning. And they end up by default as entrepreneurs because organizations cannot, not really contain, but are not set up to function that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes perfect sense. But I also like what you're saying, that outside of a diagnosis or a neurodevelopmental difference like ADHD, the dynamics, the unresolved dynamics of our lives, of our psyches, of our unconscious, whatever, can play themselves out in any relational group, and that includes work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's no line, although there, people do complain that they're one person at home and one person at work. But in general, that's a pretty hard shtick to pull off, and you end up being one person, and so your dysfunction or your trauma or your challenges are going to show up both places.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite takeaways from the career counseling course I took in grad school was that the best thing that you can do is help them develop the self-awareness, help them learn their own personality, right? And we mostly, in that class, we mostly talked about personality and career fit. So I love this distinction of values and personality and aptitude to kind of pull that fuller picture together. They're going to have a much, not just much easier time in their career, but will probably be much more successful in that career if there's that alignment. What so many people, because I went to Wesleyan and then Northwestern for grad school. And so, a lot of high achievers, right? And a lot of these students, they all went into consulting and investment banking and all these things. And it's just, it's so funny to see because I know every kind of class or generation sees this repeat, but now, now we're in our early 30s and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I opened up a med spa, or like I went and became a chef, or like, and they're doing great. You know what I mean? I don't know if you caught it, but there was this lovely, there was this absolutely lovely essay. I believe that the writer passed. I think she went to Brown, but it was called When Artichokes Have Doubts. Are you familiar with this little piece of writing?
That sounds really good, though. I'd love to read that.
I think you should read it. It was basically an exploration as to why are all these Ivy League graduates going into consulting? And what does that really mean?
They're going into it because of the money. No, I mean, these are my people. These are the students I deal with, and.
Oh, you should read it. It's if I'm remembering correctly, and I hope I'm not misremembering this, I think she actually got into a car accident or bike accident, but her writing became more prolific after that because people started putting it on the internet, and she was very talented. And so I would strongly recommend that you or anyone else listening go read this. And speaking of reading things, I know that I'm even more inspired by your book and your work now that I've gotten to talk to you. How can people go find the book, and how can they keep up with you on social media or wherever else you're kind of putting out content and resources for people?
Thank you so much for asking. The book is Becoming You, Crafting the Authentic Life You Want to Lead. You can get it anywhere. It's on Amazon and everywhere else. I'm on Instagram. It's Suzy Welch. And if you want to learn more about what I'm up to all the time, go to SuzyWelch.com. That's where all my tools are. If you're interested in taking the Values Bridge, or any of the other tools I have, they're all there. And my workshops are all there on my website.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you again so much for coming on. And for those of you who are still listening, please remember to like, rate, subscribe, share this episode, talk about it. I took so much away. I know all of you will as well, or you have, assuming you listen this far. And stay tuned for the next episode of Psychobabble. Thank you.